If you were to walk the narrow stone corridors of ancient Thebes at dusk, when the Nile turned bronze beneath the fading sun, you would find a city breathing softly, almost imperceptibly, beneath the weight of its own grandeur. Thebes, once capital of Upper Egypt, was not a city of stillness in its essence, but one of ritual rhythm. Priests chanted the same prayers for generations, the hum of artisans filled the air near the temple of Karnak, and the slow, steady beat of life echoed through its courtyards and markets. Yet within the heart of this ancient city, beyond the temple walls and palaces where pharaohs proclaimed their divine right, another kind of power stirred. It was quiet, like the whisper of papyrus brushed by the desert wind. It lived in the chambers of women, some wives, some concubines, and a few courtesans of the court, whose lives were woven into the silk threads of Egypt's political fabric. They were not written into the annals of power directly. Scribes rarely spoke their names, but they were there, behind the men who ruled the two lands, shaping destinies in silence. Thebes, around the 18th dynasty, roughly 1500 BCE, was a city that embodied devotion. The temples to Amun rose like mountains of limestone, and the processions that honored the god filled the streets with incense and song. At the height of Egypt's imperial reach, wealth poured into the city from Nubia, Canaan, and beyond. Gold from Kush, cedar from Lebanon, lapis from the east. All flowed through Thebes, enriching not only its temples but the private estates of its elite. Within these estates, behind walls painted with scenes of banquets and harvests, lived women whose daily existence was as measured and deliberate as the sun's course across the sky. Among them were the Kana, or singers of the temple, trained from youth to serve both gods and kings with music, movement, and grace. Some of these women came from noble families, offered as gifts of loyalty or piety. Others were selected for their beauty, wit, or skill. It was from among the Kenna that many of the pharaoh's courtesans were chosen. The title itself, Hemet Nesu, meaning wife of the king, was broad and layered. It could refer to the great royal wife, the queen whose name would appear in cartouches, or to lesser wives and concubines who served ritual or personal roles in the palace. In Thebes, during the reigns of powerful monarchs like Amenhotep II or Thutmose IV, the royal household was immense, and these women numbered in the dozens. But beyond the hierarchies and ceremonies lay something subtler. These courtesans were not merely companions. They were instruments of alliance, embodiments of status, and, at times, keepers of state secrets. In their quiet chambers, between the golden walls painted with lotus and papyrus, they listened. The routines of these women were steady, repetitive, and rich with meaning. A courtesan of the royal house would rise before dawn, often to the faint music of temple flutes in the distance. Her attendants would bring jars of perfumed oil, water drawn from the Nile, and cosmetics made from crushed minerals, malachite for the eyes, ochre for the lips. The act of adornment was not vanity, it was devotion. To beautify oneself in Egypt was to honor the god's perfection manifest in the human form. After her toilette, she might be summoned to the temple to participate in rituals that reinforced the pharaoh's divinity. Music was central to these ceremonies. The rhythmic clapping of menat necklaces, the gentle sound of sistrums shaking in harmony, it all carried symbolic weight. In such moments, courtesans and temple musicians were intermediaries between the mortal and divine. Their songs praised the living god-king. Their dances were offerings of loyalty and submission. Yet, behind these rituals was an intricate web of politics. Courtesans often came from powerful families, whose daughters' presence in the harem strengthened ties between noble houses and the crown. Some were foreign-born, daughters of vassal rulers sent as tokens of allegiance or as part of peace treaties. To the modern ear, these arrangements may seem coldly transactional, but in the ancient world, marriage and companionship were instruments of diplomacy. The pharaoh's harem, known as the Kana, or House of the Harem, was not only a domestic space but a political institution. It was heavily guarded, administratively complex, and staffed by hundreds of servants, scribes, and guards. The overseer of the harem, typically a trusted eunuch or noble, managed resources, scheduled audiences, and ensured that the pharaoh's domestic and ritual needs were met. Within those walls, courtesans lived according to a strict hierarchy, their days filled with ritual duties, musical rehearsals, and lessons in etiquette. The higher ranking among them might even receive instruction in reading hieratic script, a rare privilege for women. Among the courtesans, alliances formed quietly. Friendships could be as fleeting as the fragrance of lotus oil. Rivalries, on the other hand, could last a lifetime. The stakes were immense. A single moment of favor from the pharaoh could elevate a woman's family to unprecedented status. while a rumor or a whisper could bring disgrace. If you imagine walking through the gardens of the royal residence at Malkata, Amenhotep's vast palace complex near Thebes, you would see rows of sycamore and acacia trees planted beside reflecting pools. The air would carry the scent of blue lotus and myrrh. There were corridors so long that even the footsteps of a single servant would echo endlessly. Somewhere within those halls, a young woman might sit beside a harp, her fingers tracing the strings while she sang softly of love and loyalty. Her song would not be heard beyond the walls, but her presence would be recorded indirectly, in inscriptions of royal feasts, in tomb paintings showing anonymous female musicians, and in the records of dowries and gifts exchanged between families. She was part of a larger system, a quiet force in a civilization that prized order above all else. But not all courtesans remained anonymous. There are rare glimpses in history where their names surfaced, momentarily breaking through the layers of silence. One such woman was Tai, the great royal wife of Amenhotep II. She began her life as the daughter of a provincial official, not of royal blood, yet rose to become one of the most powerful women in Egyptian history. Tai's influence began, as many stories did, in the inner chambers of Thebes. She was reputed to be intelligent, composed, and politically astute. While she was eventually named Great Royal Wife, her early years in the court likely resembled those of many courtesans, navigating the delicate interplay of charm, intellect, and obedience that defined survival in the palace. Her rise transformed the perception of what a royal consort could be. For the first time, statues and inscriptions depicted the queen beside the pharaoh as an equal figure. Foreign kings addressed her directly in correspondence, a remarkable breach of diplomatic convention. Tai's life demonstrates the possibility that within the seemingly monotonous routines of palace women, there was room for maneuver, for quiet influence, and for power cloaked in gentleness. But most courtesans were not queens, nor did they leave behind monuments of stone. Their stories remained scattered in the debris of time, ostraca with fragments of poetry, inscriptions that mention anonymous singers of Ammon, or depictions of women in banquets painted in faint colors that have faded over 3,000 years. To study them is to reconstruct a mosaic from missing pieces. We know, for instance, that many of these women served dual roles both as entertainers and as participants in religious rituals. The line between sacred and sensual was not sharply drawn in ancient Egypt. Music, dance, and physical beauty were seen as divine expressions, not moral transgressions. To please the pharaoh was, in a sense, to honor the gods. The courtesans of Thebes lived at the intersection of these worlds. They were both visible and invisible, adorned in gold and linen, yet largely erased from written history. Their voices, if they could speak across time, would not tell tales of passion or intrigue as later legends might imagine, but of endurance, repetition, and ritual. They would speak of long hours spent learning the delicate postures of temple dance, of waiting for summons that might never come, of watching from behind carved screens as diplomats and priests debated the fate of empires. They would speak of a life spent in service, neither free nor entirely captive, within the measured rhythm of Theban order. And yet, through all the monotony, a subtle truth emerges. The history of Egypt was not written by kings alone. It was sung, whispered, and carried in the gestures of women whose names we no longer know. In the quiet corridors of the harem, after the day's rituals were complete and the night lamps flickered low, perhaps one courtesan, unnamed in the records, unremembered in the tombs, looked out toward the dark Nile. The water would have shimmered faintly in the moonlight, reflecting the temples of the gods she served, but could never approach freely. She may have wondered, in that stillness, whether her life mattered beyond the walls, whether her songs, her movements, her presence were truly her own, or simply echoes of power greater than herself. Thebes was a city of endurance, and she, like it, endured. But as centuries passed and dynasties fell, what became of these women, the unseen weavers of Egypt's private history? What remnants of their influence might still linger beneath the sands, waiting for discovery? By the time the sun rose over Thebes each morning, the courtyards of the royal harem were already awake. You could hear the faint sound of sandals on polished floors, the rustle of linen garments, the soft clinking of jewelry being fastened. To an outsider, had outsiders ever been permitted beyond those guarded gates, it might have seemed like a place of luxury, even leisure. But the harem was less a place of pleasure than one of precision. Every gesture, every breath, carried a meaning defined by centuries of ritual. The pharaoh's harem was not a single hall filled with reclining figures, as later imaginations would suggest. It was a complex, sprawling network of chambers, gardens, and administrative offices. Each woman had her assigned place. Servants kept track of provisions, wine, oil, grain, and scribes recorded even the smallest expenses in neat hieratic script on ostraca. There was order here and hierarchy. The women at the top of this hierarchy were courtesans of rank, chosen not merely for beauty, but for lineage, loyalty, and skill. These courtesans lived within carefully measured boundaries, but within those limits they learned to move with a kind of quiet intelligence. They knew which priest to greet, which official to please, which servant might carry their words safely. They learned to speak in coded politeness, to express affection or displeasure through tone rather than declaration. Words were dangerous in the palace. Silence often was safer. It was through this silence that influence was exercised. The pharaoh's attention, though fleeting, could shift the balance of families and fortunes. To be favored meant one's brothers might receive military appointments, one's father new lands, one's lineage a closer tie to the divine blood of kings. But favor was unpredictable. A single ill-timed remark, a misplaced glance, or an unlucky dream could end a life of quiet comfort. And yet, some women managed to endure, not through open ambition, but through consistency. We know this not from stories told directly, but from the bureaucratic fragments that survive. A surviving papyrus, often called the Wilbur Papyrus, records the distribution of lands in Thebes during the late New Kingdom. Among the names of priests and scribes appear designations such as property of the house of the harem of Amun. This tells us that the harem was not merely domestic. It was an economic entity, managing fields, livestock, and workers. The women of the harem, though secluded, were therefore participants in the Egyptian economy. Their food came from the same state granaries that supplied temples. Their jewelry was made by the same artisans who crafted amulets for the gods. Through their existence, the state functioned in miniature, a reflection of the order that the pharaoh claimed to maintain in the cosmos. In this way, courtesans were part of Egypt's system of Mat, the divine order of truth, balance, and justice. Their submission to hierarchy mirrored the obedience of all Egypt to its god-king, but beneath this order ran quieter, human desires, longing, resentment, and the hope of being remembered. Consider, for example, the tale of a woman known only by her title Shemate, in Amun, the singer of Amun. Her name appears in a tomb inscription at Deir el-Medina, the workers' village across the Nile from Thebes. The inscription notes that she was buried with fine linen wrappings and a small gilded mirror, a gift, the text suggests, from one who remembered her. Historians speculate she may have been connected to the harem or temple choir. She was not royal nor powerful, but her burial speaks of affection, perhaps even of quiet influence. Someone, somewhere valued her presence enough to ensure she was not forgotten. It is through such fragments that we glimpse the lives of these women, flickering faintly like oil lamps against the darkness of time. They were not simply passive figures. The women of Thebes were trained in music and poetry, arts that carried deep cultural weight. The songs they sang were both entertainment and education, repeating the stories of gods and kings, reinforcing the moral and cosmic order of Egypt. One surviving hymn, recorded in the papyrus Chester Beti, is written from the perspective of a female singer praising her beloved. Scholars believe such hymns were performed in courtly settings, perhaps even before the pharaoh himself. The language is tender, restrained, and formal, but behind the rhythm there is something deeply personal. These songs may have been the only form of self-expression available to the women who performed them. Through art they existed, however briefly, outside the roles imposed upon them. But even art was political in Thebes. Music, perfume, and beauty were not only sensual pleasures, they were tools of control and display. The pharaoh's body, and by extension his court, were symbols of divine order. Everything that touched them had meaning. The oils used to anoint the skin of the pharaoh were the same used in the rituals of Amun. The fabrics woven for the courtesans were chosen for their color symbolism: white for purity, blue for divinity, red for vitality. Even the architecture of the harem reinforced control. Rooms were arranged in long corridors leading inward, each level more restricted than the last. The outer chambers were busy with servants and guards. The inner sanctums were quiet, perfumed, and dimly lit. To pass through each doorway was to cross a threshold of privilege. There were moments when this order trembled. Letters from the Amarna archives, written a century after Amenhotep Kai, mention gifts sent to Egypt from foreign kings' daughters, nieces, and noblewomen, given as part of diplomatic marriages. Some of these women, displaced from their homelands, brought with them new languages, new customs, and perhaps new ambitions. Imagine the loneliness of such a woman, perhaps a princess from Mitanni or Babylon, arriving in Thebes after months of travel by chariot and boat. She would find herself surrounded by strange faces, bound by laws she did not know, her speech understood only through interpreters. To survive, she would have to observe quietly, to learn the invisible codes that governed every gesture. Her attendants might have taught her how to apply coal without smudging, how to bow before the pharaoh without speaking unless addressed, how to walk slowly, with head lowered. These were not mere courtesies, they were performances of submission required for survival. Some of these foreign courtesans bore children, half Egyptian heirs whose existence quietly linked empires. Others faded into obscurity, their names lost even from the archives that once recorded their dowries. But through them, Egypt absorbed the cultures of its neighbors. Their silences shaped the boundaries of diplomacy just as surely as armies and treaties did. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the murmur of these women's lives beneath the louder noise of history. The scratch of a scribe's reed pen, the clatter of ivory combs, the hum of conversation in shaded courtyards. For them, power was not taken but suggested. Influence was built in gestures, maintained through consistency, and exercised in moments of attention. Even the pharaoh, divine as he was believed to be, depended on their company to maintain the illusion of completeness. A solitary god-king would have been a contradiction in terms. Egypt's cosmic order required balance between male and female forces. The courtesans of Thebes embodied that balance, their beauty serving as a living metaphor for harmony. Yet for all this symbolic importance, their humanity remained hidden behind the imagery. Tomb art showed them as elegant silhouettes, elongated, perfect, emotionless. The scribes rarely recorded their words, only their titles. To find the women themselves, one must look in the spaces between, the quiet details of daily life. We know, for instance, that women in the royal court kept small cosmetic boxes carved from wood or alabaster decorated with lotus motifs. Inside were not only pigments and combs, but sometimes personal charms, tiny amulets in the shape of fish or eyes, meant to bring fertility or protection. These were tokens of private belief, unseen by the pharaoh or the priests. Within the constraints of ritual, there was still a trace of individuality, of hope. As centuries turned, the balance of power in Thebes began to shift. The wealth of the temples grew, the authority of the pharaoh waned, and the once mighty palace became a shadow of its former brilliance. Yet even in decline, the institution of the courtesans endured. The harem remained an administrative center, and women continued to be trained in the arts that once served the glory of the kings. When the tomb of the artisan Ka was uncovered in Deir el-Medina, archaeologists found delicate perfumes, linens, and mirrors among the burial goods. Some believe they were modeled after items from the royal harem, proof of how deeply the culture of the court permeated Egyptian society. The courtesans, though secluded, influenced fashion, language, and the rituals of beauty for centuries. Their existence shaped the rhythm of Egypt itself, a quiet pulse beneath the grandeur of temples and monuments. And yet, the more we uncover, the more we realize how little we know of their private lives. Their names, faces, and voices remain elusive, trapped within fragments of text and fading paint. In the end, the courtesans of Thebes remind us that history is not made only by generals and kings, but by those who moved silently through the corridors of power, unseen but essential. Still, one question lingers, suspended like dust in the late afternoon air of Thebes, when the pharaohs fell silent and the temples turned to ruin. What traces of these women, these silent arbiters of beauty and power, remained beneath the sands? Were their songs once sung to honor kings, lost forever, or merely waiting to be heard again? By the time the last of the great pharaohs of the new kingdom passed into legend, Thebes had already begun to change. The city that had once glittered with gold and rituals slowly surrendered to dust and quiet. The Nile, eternal as always, kept flowing, but the rhythm of its banks grew subdued. The grand processions that once filled the air with music gave way to smaller ceremonies, fewer offerings, thinner incense smoke. The empire's reach had grown brittle. Foreign powers pressed in from the North. Nubian kingdoms rose in the south, and internal strife spread through the priesthoods and palaces alike. Amid these changes, the women who had once embodied the grace and continuity of the pharaoh's household became both less visible and, paradoxically, more enduring. In decline, Egypt remembered its courtesans not as individuals, but as symbols, idealized figures carved into reliefs, painted on coffins, sung about in poetry. The real women vanished, but their image persisted, Their faces were smoothed into archetypes: the serene musician, the silent devotee, the eternal consort. The living courtesan, with her laughter, ambition, and fatigue, was replaced by the idea of her. But if you look closely, the remnants of their lives still whisper from the ground. Archaeologists working in Thebes often describe the faint scent of ancient perfume when sealed tombs are opened. It is fleeting, delicate, and gone almost as soon as it is noticed. Perfumed oils were a central part of harem life, symbols of sensuality, purity, and the divine touch. The lingering traces of myrrh, lotus, and frankincense that sometimes greet modern excavators are the ghosts of a vanished intimacy. They are the courtesan's last breath, reaching across 3 millennia. In one tomb, belonging to a royal servant of the harem named Nebamun, a wall painting shows a banquet. Women with long wigs and delicate necklaces play harps and lutes, their bodies painted in shades of ochre and gold. Some sit cross-legged, others recline on cushions, passing cups of wine. Scholars have studied this scene for over a century, debating whether the women were professional entertainers, priestesses, or royal companions. Perhaps they were all three. The painting is still luminous, even now. The women's gazes are calm but alive. You can almost imagine the gentle rustle of their linen garments, the murmur of conversation, the faint laughter between notes of the harp. These are not goddesses or allegories. They are human beings caught in the act of living. Their beauty is not distant. It is immediate, tangible, almost fragile. The daily life of the courtesans, what they ate, how they passed their afternoons, how they aged, is largely unknown. But a few glimpses survive in letters and household records. An ostrakon from Deir el Medina mentions deliveries of honey and dried figs for the singers of Amun. Another lists oil rations for the women of the Perkana. The quantities are small, suggesting sustenance more than luxury. These women lived structured, repetitive lives: morning devotions, music rehearsals, embroidery, temple processions. They were not idle. They were essential parts of the religious machinery that kept Egypt's ideology intact. Even as the kingdom's power waned, the pharaoh's divine image had to be maintained. The courtesans' rituals of beauty, bathing, perfuming, adorning, were extensions of that image. Each gesture reaffirmed cosmic order. To paint the eyes with kohl was to channel the protective power of Horus. To anoint the skin with oil was to invoke rebirth, like the sun emerging from the horizon each day. These actions, mundane and endlessly repeated, were spiritual acts disguised as daily routine. In their constancy, they held Egypt together longer than its armies or scribes. As new dynasties rose and fell, Thebes itself began to crumble. Its palaces emptied, its harems dissolved, its courtesans forgotten. By the Third Intermediate Period, the once mighty city was half in ruin. The priests of Amun ruled from its temples while the royal courts shifted north to Tanis and later to Sars. Still, traces of the old system persisted in fragments. Titles such as Singer of the Interior of the Temple and Hand of the God continued to appear on stela. The line between courtesan, priestess, and entertainer blurred until it vanished entirely. The women who once attended the pharaoh now served the gods directly. In this transformation lay a quiet kind of endurance. Though the political harem disappeared, its traditions, the music, the ritual of beauty, the sanctity of femininity, became woven into Egyptian religion itself. The courtesans' devotion outlived their masters. When later Greek visitors wrote of Egypt, they marveled at the reverence given to female musicians in temple rites. They did not realize that these rituals were the final echoes of Thebes' courtesans, women whose hands once poured wine for kings, now pouring libations for gods. The irony of history is that silence, once a tool of survival, became their legacy. The courtesans had lived quietly, avoided direct power, and remained invisible in the written record. And so, when their world faded, they left behind no scandals, no revolts, no epics, only the faint memory of music and perfume. Yet this silence is not absence. It is endurance of another kind. In every tomb painting where a woman plays a harp beside a banquet, in every alabaster jar shaped like a lotus blossom, in every faint trace of oil absorbed by ancient linen, there remains something of them. The courtesans of Thebes are still here, their presence diffused into the landscape of Egypt like the scent of myrrh in the desert air. Their influence persists in ways even they could never have imagined. The aesthetics of grace, balance, and adornment that they embodied shaped Egyptian art for centuries. Later civilizations borrowed these ideals: the Greeks, the Romans, the artists of the Renaissance, each reinterpreting Egyptian beauty without knowing the women who first lived it. As night falls again over the ruins of Thebes, you can imagine the courtesans' old chambers bathed in moonlight. The walls, long stripped of gold, still hold faint traces of color. A fragment of a mirror lies in the dust. A carved wooden comb, the teeth worn smooth by use, rests beside a pile of pottery shards. No music plays there now. The gardens are gone, the pools are dry, and the reeds whisper only to the wind. But perhaps if you stood still long enough, you might sense something beneath the silence, a feeling of order, of calm devotion, of centuries turning without haste. That was the world they knew, a world where time itself was measured by repetition, where every act, no matter how small, carried the weight of eternity. The courtesans of Thebes lived and died within that rhythm. They adorned the divine, soothed the powerful, and gave beauty to a civilization obsessed with permanence. Their names may be gone, but their purpose remains to remind us that even the quietest lives can leave marks deeper than stone. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine Thebes not as a ruin, but as it once was, its palaces shimmering in the heat, the Nile glinting beneath the sun, and somewhere in the distance, the faint music of women's voices rising in harmony. They are singing still, perhaps not for kings, but for time itself. If you had wandered into a monastery in northern England sometime in the 13th century, long before dawn, you would have heard the sound of bells before you saw any light. A single tone, deep and hollow, rolling over the hills and through the damp mist. It was the signal for matins, the night office, the first of 8 daily prayers that divided the monastic day into sacred intervals. The monks of that time did not wake by sunlight or by choice. They woke by obedience. In stone chambers barely warmer than the air outside, men wrapped in coarse wool rose from narrow beds and moved toward the chapel. There, by the faint glow of oil lamps, they sang the first prayers of the day. For them, time was not an abstract idea. It was a sacred rhythm, a divine order. To pray at the right hour was to participate in God's structure of the universe. To be late, even by a few moments, was to break that order. And yet, in those years, there was no reliable way to tell time. Before the invention of mechanical clocks, monasteries relied on a mixture of human vigilance and natural signs to mark the passing hours. A monk called the Horarius was responsible for keeping watch. His duty was both simple and unending: to observe the stars, the position of the moon, the length of shadows, and the slow fading of candles. He determined when to ring the bells for each office: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Each of these moments had to be precise. Prayer was not spontaneous in a monastery, it was scheduled devotion. The Horarius's accuracy was therefore a matter of spiritual discipline. In the winter months, this task was grueling. The night was long, the sky clouded, and the cold unrelenting. The candles burned unevenly, and wax dripped onto the ledgers that recorded the monastic hours. To stay awake, the Horarius often walked the cloister in circles, whispering psalms to himself, counting breaths to measure time. Some monasteries used water clocks or clepsydrae, inherited from Roman engineering. These devices measured time through the slow dripping of water from one container to another. But they were unreliable. Temperature changed the rate of flow, and during frost, the water froze entirely. Others used marked candles, where time was tracked by how far the wax melted. But candles burned irregularly, and drafts from the chapel doors distorted the flame. The monks lived, quite literally, by the fluid and fickle passage of time. The monastery at St. Albans, like many others, was a world within walls. It had its own orchards, fields, stables, kitchens, scriptoria, and infirmary. Dozens of men moved through it daily, each bound by obedience to a rhythm older than any of them. At the center of this world was the abbot, the spiritual and administrative leader. His responsibility was to maintain not only piety but order, temporal and spiritual. The precision of the monastery's hours reflected his authority. If prayers were late, meals delayed, or candles lit at the wrong time, it signaled disorder, a failure of discipline. And so, beneath the chants and incense, there was a quiet, ongoing struggle, the effort to make time tangible, measurable, controllable. It was a struggle of devotion disguised as practicality. In the 1200s, as cathedrals rose across Europe, a new problem began to appear. Builders, masons, and scholars needed more consistent timekeeping. Daily life outside monasteries was slowly changing. Markets opened at set hours. Civic councils met at scheduled times. Merchants kept accounts across growing distances. The natural signs of day and night were no longer enough. It was in the monasteries, however, that the solution first began to take shape. Sometime around the year 1270, the monks of St. Albans and Salisbury began experimenting with weight-driven mechanisms to replace the water clock. These devices used falling weights connected by ropes to gears and spindles, what we now recognize as the earliest forms of mechanical clocks. The driving idea was simple but radical. Time could be regulated by motion, not by nature. The movement of a wheel could mark the passing of hours more faithfully than the sun or stars. The first of these clocks did not have faces or hands. They existed as sound, not sight. Their only purpose was to strike a bell at fixed intervals, audible order for a world still learning to measure itself. Imagine for a moment one of these early machines in the dark interior of a monastery tower. The air smells faintly of oil and iron. The gears, handmade by blacksmiths more familiar with horseshoes than instruments, grind softly. The rope unwinds at a steady pace, turning wooden wheels fitted with notches. Each notch counts a moment, each motion one step closer to the ringing of the bell. A monk sits nearby with a candle, watching the mechanism, recording its rhythm in notes that would look to us like music rather than mathematics. He listens, not for perfection, but for consistency. Every few hours he rewinds the weight, checks the pendulum, adjusts a wooden peg. Outside, the abbey sleeps. The stars drift behind clouds. The bell rings. The sound carries across the village below, startling a farmer awake, echoing through a mill house, scattering birds from the trees. The peasants may not know the exact hour, but they recognize its authority. The monastery's bell does not simply mark time, it defines it. In these quiet experiments lay the beginning of the modern world's obsession with precision. The monks sought only regularity for prayer, but in doing so they created the framework for secular timekeeping, for factories, railways, and schedules centuries later. And yet, the early mechanical clock was imperfect. Its rhythm often faltered, its bells rang early or late, and its upkeep was constant. Still, it was more dependable than the eye or the star. In many monasteries, debates arose over whether mechanical clocks were an intrusion upon divine order. Some argued that it was prideful to measure time by human invention rather than natural signs. Others, more practical, claimed that the clock was a gift of stability, an aid to devotion, not a challenge to it. The argument was never formally settled. The monks simply adjusted their bells and kept praying. To live in a medieval monastery was to live within measured stillness. The world beyond its walls changed. Kings ruled and died, wars burned and cooled, but inside, life remained steady. The clock did not bring haste, it brought rhythm. Meals were served in silence, each bite synchronized with readings from scripture. Manuscripts were copied by candlelight in the scriptorium, where scribes worked until the bell for compliance sounded. The sound of the bell was both interruption and comfort, a reminder that time belonged to God. And yet, even the most disciplined monk must have felt something different in those moments. The awareness that time, once fluid, was becoming fixed. That the hours were no longer guessed but measured, that something invisible had been captured, made tangible, audible. Perhaps he felt pride or perhaps unease. The bell that called him to prayer was no longer the voice of heaven. It was the sound of a machine. As winter came and the river froze, the monastery grew quieter still. Candles smoked. The clock continued its slow turning. Each tick, though the word had not yet been invented, marked a step towards something neither the monks nor their abbots could foresee, a world where time itself would become the measure of all things. But for now, in the dark stillness of the 13th century, the monks of Thebes' distant successors, those who once prayed by starlight, listened to their new clock ring through the cold air and thought only of the next prayer. They did not know they had changed the world. By the beginning of the 14th century, a quiet transformation was spreading across Europe. It did not march with armies or arrive in gilded caravans. It ticked, it rang, and it counted. The mechanical clock, once hidden within monastery towers, began to move into cities. The first public clock is believed to have appeared around 1283 in Dunstable Priory, not far from London. Others followed in Milan, in Padua, and in the market square of Rouen, where the bell tower's rhythmic striking startled citizens unused to such precision. The sound of a regulated hour was a novelty, an artificial heartbeat pulsing through medieval life. But this new rhythm did not belong only to God. It began to belong to people. In the early 1300s, towns were beginning to bustle in ways monasteries never had. Markets opened with sunrise, guilds met in halls, blacksmiths struck their forges, bakers kneaded their dough, and merchants weighed goods brought from distant ports. The marketplace thrived on activity, yet there was no common measure to order it all. Time before the public clock was personal. The butcher worked until the light faded. The merchant closed when trade slowed. The farmer followed the length of the shadows across his fields. The arrival of the town clock changed that. Now, a bell rang not for prayer, but for commerce. It announced the opening of gates, the start of labor, the closing of stalls. For the first time, the rhythm of daily life became synchronized. not by the sun, not by instinct, but by a machine. The great clockmakers of the 14th century were craftsmen of a new kind. They combined the skills of blacksmiths, mathematicians, and dreamers. Few could read, but they understood motion, tension, and sound. Their work was both science and art. In a narrow workshop beneath a church steeple, you might have found one such man, a clockmaker named Richard of Wallingford. Born the son of a blacksmith, he rose to become the abbot of St. Albans Abbey in 1326. A brilliant mathematician, he designed one of the most complex clocks of his time, a device not only to strike the hours but to display the movement of the sun, moon, and stars. His striarium, as it was called, was an attempt to capture the universe in metal and wood. Richard's clock never fully worked as intended. Its gears were too intricate, its tolerances too fine for the tools of his day. But the idea was revolutionary, a single machine that mirrored the heavens, that could predict not only the hour of prayer, but the rhythm of creation itself. The monks of St. Albans had once prayed to keep pace with God. Now, one of their own was building a mechanism to understand his timing. Elsewhere in Europe, similar ambitions took shape. In France, Henri de Vic constructed a clock for the palace in Paris that struck every hour with remarkable regularity. In Italy, Giovanni de Dondi spent 16 years perfecting his astronomical clock in Padua, a masterpiece of over 100 moving parts. These clocks were grand statements of intellect and faith, but also of control. They displayed power, the ability of men and cities to command time itself, and yet their reliability was still fragile. The gears wore down, the weights tangled, the escapements, a delicate mechanism that released energy in controlled intervals, often jammed. Clock keepers had to climb the towers each day to wend the ropes, clean the dust, and reset the wheels. The clock, like the people who built it, needed constant care to stay alive. In the town square, life began to adjust around these sounds. Bakers learned to begin kneading dough not when they awoke, but when the first bell struck dawn. Merchants agreed to open their shutters at the second bell. Schools began at the third. The ringing of the hour became both comfort and command. Some resisted it. In London and Florence alike, there were grumbles that the clock's insistence was unnatural, that it forced men to labor longer, or at times when light was scarce. The older generation remembered when the day was guided by the body, not by a machine. But the younger ones adapted easily. To them, the sound of the bell was part of life's fabric, as natural as birdsong. Time had become external, audible, shared. Back within the monasteries, the relationship to time was also shifting. The clock had freed the horarius from his endless vigil. No longer did a single man need to watch the stars or candle flame to judge the hour. The machine did the watching. In some accounts, this was described as a mercy. In others, a loss. The monks continued to mark their prayers with precision, but something subtle had changed. The connection between divine rhythm and human intuition had been replaced with the mechanical regularity of the clock. The bells still called them to prayer, but the sound came from iron teeth and spinning wheels. The devotion was the same, the meaning quietly different. By the mid-14th century, Europe's landscape was dotted with clocks. Cities competed to build the largest and most beautiful, each tower a monument to progress, each mechanism a marvel of human craftsmanship. The clock of Strasbourg, completed in 1352, displayed not only the time but the date, the phases of the moon, and the positions of planets. In Prague, the astronomical clock would soon join it, turning slowly above the old town square, its figures of saints and skeletons marking the passage of hours and lives alike. People gathered to watch these machines move. Children pointed at their rotating dials. Merchants set their ledgers by them. The clock became a spectacle, a public assurance that time could be trusted, that the world was not chaos but order. In an age of plague, famine, and war, that sound was comfort itself. And yet, there was an irony in this new precision. The more accurately people could measure time, the more they began to feel its loss. Hours, once indistinguishable, became countable things, finite, ownable, spendable. Merchants began to think in terms of hourly wages. Laborers rented out their time. Students studied by the hour. Time became not only sacred but economic. The clock had begun as a tool for prayer. Now it had become a tool for work. Still, for those who built and maintained these great machines, the clock was not yet a symbol of pressure or productivity. It was a mystery, part art, part devotion. Each wheel and gear moved with purpose, each weight descended with grace. To watch it was to witness an imitation of life itself: energy, motion, pause, and release. In the quiet of a tower, a clock keeper might lean close to the mechanism, listening to its rhythm. Tick, pause, tick. Each sound was a heartbeat of the world. And perhaps in that stillness he might have wondered whether the clock was truly obeying his design, or whether he, like the rest of the world, was beginning to obey it. By the end of the 14th century, every major city in Europe possessed a public clock. The bell that once summoned monks to matins now echoed across markets and alleys, calling bakers, merchants, and soldiers alike. The mechanical age had begun, not with steam or steel, but with iron gears in a tower. But time, once liberated from the monastery, would not stay peaceful for long. The question remains, when the bell of the town tower first rang through the marketplace, who truly ruled the hour, the people or the machine? When the 15th century opened, Europe had begun to listen differently. The church bells that had once been scattered voices calling across villages now formed a kind of rhythm, a pattern shared by all who lived within earshot. From dawn until dusk, the sound of the striking hour structured the day. It separated the sacred from the ordinary, labor from rest, and the self from eternity. But something was changing in that sound. The bell no longer spoke only to the faithful, it spoke to everyone. The monks who first measured time had done so to bring order to prayer. But as cities grew and kingdoms expanded, others began to use the clock for more practical ends: trade, taxation, warfare, travel. The rhythm of devotion had quietly become the rhythm of empire. The clock spread with astonishing speed. In England, towns like Wells and Exeter installed clock towers whose dials showed not only the hour, but the movement of stars and even animated figures that struck bells with hammers. In Flanders, clockmakers began refining the escapement mechanism, giving the machines smoother, more consistent motion. By 1450, the design had become stable enough that clockmakers could reproduce their work from one city to another. The art of clockmaking was now a trade, an apprenticeship, a business. The names of these men, once anonymous, began to appear in civic records: Jehan de Beauvais in Paris, Nicolas Argent in Dijon, Henry de Week in London. Each spent their lives perfecting devices they would never live to see replaced. It was an age of steady progress, measured by sound. Within monasteries, the old clocks kept ticking. Their keepers, often grey-haired monks who had inherited the duty from a long line of predecessors, wound the weights, oiled the gears, and kept the rhythm alive. The machines, though primitive by later standards, remained astonishingly reliable. Visitors described the hypnotic motion of their gears and wheels. The steady hum of the clock tower was often compared to breathing, a faint metallic sigh echoing through the stone halls. Some monks said they could no longer sleep without it. But outside those walls, time was beginning to accelerate. Merchants discovered that knowing the hour allowed them to coordinate shipments, set appointments, and settle debts. Banks began issuing contracts that specified payment by the hour rather than merely by the day. Ship captains, sailing from Venice or Lisbon, measured time to calculate longitude and distance, turning the steady pulse of a pendulum into a map of the world. The mechanical clock became a foundation for precision, not piety. In workshops across Europe, inventors began to miniaturize it. They built smaller, portable devices, spring-driven mechanisms that no longer relied on heavy weights or tower space. The first portable clocks and later watches appeared among nobles and scholars. The control of time had become personal, yet with this gift came a quiet burden. When time could be measured so precisely, it could also be owned, and when it could be owned, it could be lost. The very precision that had once served prayer now demanded productivity. Work hours became fixed, rest became regulated. Even sleep began to conform to time's discipline. People began to live by the clock, not merely with it. And for the first time in human history, being late became a moral failing. Still, not everyone welcomed this new tyranny. In rural villages, farmers continued to rely on sunlight and season. To them, the sound of the town bell felt distant, almost foreign. They worked by instinct. The smell of damp soil, the angle of light, the rhythm of birds returning to their nests. But even there, the clock's influence crept in. Taxes were due at fixed times, markets opened by the hour. The great wheel of progress turned, and its sound was inescapable. By the 16th century, clocks had become symbols of wealth and authority. Princes and cardinals commissioned elaborate designs to display in their courts. Intricate creations that measured not only hours but the movements of heavenly bodies. These table clocks, adorned with gold and enamel, were both decoration and declaration, proof that time itself had become a possession. The once humble bell of the monastery had become a mark of prestige. But it was in the universities and workshops of Europe that the clock's true transformation occurred. Scholars began to notice that the regular motion of gears could do more than strike bells. It could demonstrate principles of the universe. If a machine could divide time into equal parts, perhaps the cosmos did too. This was the seed of mechanical philosophy, the belief that nature itself was a great clockwork, its movements governed by precise, knowable laws. When Galileo observed the swinging of a pendulum, he thought not of prayer but of mathematics. When Newton imagined gravity, he described it in the language of regular motion. Time, distance, force, all measurable, all calculable. The medieval clock had become the metaphor for the universe, and God, once the keeper of hours, became the great clockmaker. Still, even as science and commerce embraced its logic, the clock remained, at heart, a deeply human invention. Each one was slightly imperfect, a reflection of its maker's hand. Each one needed care. Even the finest clocks of the Renaissance lost seconds each day, their gears slipping ever so slightly, their balance shifting with the seasons. They were not timeless, they were alive. The clockmakers who tended them understood this intimately. In their notebooks, they described the sounds of their creations with affection. Words like breathing, singing, pulsing. Some even claimed to feel sadness when a clock stopped. It was to them like a heartbeat gone still. And perhaps that was true, for in its steady motion, the clock imitated something deeply human, the rhythm of persistence. By the dawn of the modern age, the clock's dominion was total. It hung in churches, in palaces, in workshops, in homes. It crossed oceans, followed armies, and eventually rode in pockets and wrists. And yet, its origins, the monks counting stars, the drip of the water clock, the flickering of a candle's flame, were still present in every tick. The desire to bring order to chaos, to give meaning to passing moments, remained unchanged. We still listen for that sound. The mechanical clock did not conquer the world by force. It conquered it by patience. Each swing of its pendulum, each drop of its weight, carried forward the same ancient wish, to understand when, and how long, and what it means to be in time. The monks of St. Albans had never intended to change humanity's relationship with the hours. They only sought to make prayer punctual. Yet their small act of discipline reshaped the centuries. They built a world where time became measurable, and in doing so, they made every moment matter. And so, as the modern world hums with watches and screens, alarms and deadlines, it is worth imagining that old bell tower again, a quiet cloister in winter, a single candle burning low, a wheel turning unseen in the dark, and a bell, soft, steady, eternal, calling across the centuries, reminding us that time, once sacred, is still something we live inside, even when we forget to listen. The question remains, when the monks first taught the world to measure time, did they realize that one day, time would begin to measure us? If you were to stand on the old Via Salaria, sometime in the 3rd century BCE, you would not have seen a grand procession of soldiers or the thunder of chariots. You would have seen dust, a line of mules carrying sacks that smelled faintly of the sea. The road shimmered under the Mediterranean sun, pale and unyielding, stretching toward Rome in one direction and the salt flats of the Adriatic in the other. The Via Salaria, the Salt Road, was one of Rome's oldest arteries. Long before emperors built marble palaces or legions conquered distant lands, this path carried something far more precious than gold. Salt, it seems mundane to us now, common, cheap, and scattered across every table. But in the ancient world, salt was life itself. Without it, food spoiled within days. Soldiers weakened, livestock sickened. Entire towns could vanish for lack of preservation. Salt kept meat edible through long winters, kept fish fresh on journeys inland, and even served as a primitive antiseptic for wounds. To Rome, salt was not a condiment. It was civilization, measured in grains and carried in sacks across the land. The first Roman roads were not built for war, but for trade. Before Rome was Rome, before it had legions or laws, it was a collection of hilltop settlements bound by necessity. The tribes of Latium, farmers, shepherds, fishermen, met where the salt paths crossed. From these exchanges, a town emerged. And from that town came the Via Salaria, a road that would one day stretch nearly 240 kilometers from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic coast. Its stones, still visible in places today, are worn smooth by centuries of footsteps and hooves. The early Romans called it simply the Road of Salt. To walk it was to follow the empire's first economy. The salt itself came from coastal flats near Ostia and the marshes of the Adriatic. There, under the heat of the Italian sun, seawater was trapped in shallow basins and left to evaporate. Over weeks, the water disappeared, leaving behind thin, glittering crusts. Workers, bare-legged and sunburned, scraped it up with wooden rakes and packed it into baskets. Each crystal of salt carried with it the breath of the sea, the tang of tides that had never seen Rome. From the flats, the salt was loaded onto carts drawn by oxen. These carts moved slowly, creaking along dirt tracks that predated the Republic. Over time, the paths deepened, carved into the earth by repetition. The Romans, always pragmatic, began to pave them with large slabs of limestone, fitted together like puzzle pieces. Each stone was carefully chosen, its edges chipped and shaped by hand. Workers poured gravel beneath for drainage, then set the slabs so tightly that grass could not grow between them. Thus, the Roman road was born, not from glory, but from commerce. A traveller on the Via Salaria in its earliest days would have met all manner of people: fishermen from the coast, shepherds driving flocks toward the city, merchants leading pack animals heavy with salt or dried fish, soldiers on patrol, and slaves carrying goods for their masters. The journey was long and unhurried. The average ox cart moved at about 2 miles per hour. From the salt flats near Castrum Trentinum to the gates of Rome, the trip could take nearly 2 weeks. At night, travellers camped along the roadside or stopped at mutations, small rest stations where animals were fed, wheels repaired, and travellers offered wine, bread, and perhaps a patch of straw to sleep on. There were no maps, no milestones in the earliest days. Only memory, habit, and the sound of hooves. And yet, over time, that steady movement created the rhythm of empire. Salt became Rome's first currency. The word salary itself comes from salarium, the allowance of salt once paid to Roman soldiers. To be worth one's salt meant to be dependable, disciplined, useful. When the Roman legions marched, they carried salt in their rations. It preserved pork and fish for campaigns that lasted months. In the field, soldiers used it to clean wounds and flavor their sparse meals of grain and oil. It was both food and medicine, necessity and luxury. And so even as Rome expanded, building roads to Gaul, Spain, Africa, and Asia Minor, the Via Salaria remained sacred. It was the road that had taught Rome how to build. The process of road building became an act of devotion. Roman engineers, grammatici they were called, walked ahead with rods and measuring cords, laying out a straight line from one hill to another. The Romans believed that roads should defy nature, not follow it. Rivers could bend, roads would not. To make the path level, they dug deep into hillsides, filled valleys with gravel, and built bridges from heavy stone. Each layer of a road had a purpose: stachman for foundation, rudus for firmness, nucleus for smoothing, and summum dorsum, the large paving stones that formed the final surface. Every road was crowned slightly in the middle to allow rain to drain away. Every ditch, every culvert, every milestone was calculated with precision. It was engineering as religion, and as Rome's roads multiplied, the salt that had inspired them continued to flow along their paths, a white thread binding the empire from sea to city, from market to garrison. Along the Via Salaria, small settlements began to grow, way stations that offered shade, food, and trade. Some became towns in their own right: Rete, Interamna, Asculum. Their markets thrived not on conquest but on continuity. The same muleteers passed through season after season. The same carts creaked along the same ruts. There was comfort in repetition. Even centuries later, travellers remarked on the monotony of the journey, the sameness of the stones, the endless horizon, the dull rhythm of iron rims on rock. But that monotony was Rome's triumph. Predictability meant control. Every road that led to Rome began like this, an exercise in patience, maintenance, and discipline. The salt moved, the coins exchanged hands, and the empire lived another day. In the heat of summer, the Via Salaria shimmered as if alive. The stones trapped sunlight until they burned the soles of bare feet. Dust rose from every step, mixing with the scent of olive oil, sweat, and mule leather. Travelers shielded their eyes and kept walking. To stop was to invite exhaustion. There were dangers too. Bandits haunted the forests beyond Rete, and in spring, the rivers swelled until bridges vanished beneath the current. But the Roman traveller trusted the road. It was the one thing in a shifting world that stayed firm beneath the feet. Even the poorest could walk it, and in walking, belonged to something larger than themselves. When the sun fell, the road cooled and darkened. Crickets began their song. Campfires flickered along the ditches. A mule brayed somewhere in the distance. The salt caravans settled for the night, and the air filled with quiet voices and the smell of grain cooking in small pots. The road, silent by day, became human again by night. Stories were traded between travellers of markets in Rome, of the emperor's taxes, of floods that ruined the harvest, of strange omens seen in the sky. Always, someone would speak of the sea, its taste, its brightness, its endlessness, and how strange it was that so much of it had to be carried inland, one handful at a time. In this way, salt moved through the veins of empire as blood moves through a body, slowly, constantly, invisibly. And as the caravans trudged toward Rome, their sacks heavy and their pace unchanging, They were unknowingly building something more enduring than empire connection. For every road was a message written in stone, a declaration that movement was life, that even the simplest trade, the carrying of salt, could bind a world together. But salt had its own kind of politics. It could enrich cities or starve them. Whoever controlled the supply controlled obedience itself. Rome learned this early, and it never forgot. The Senate set laws on its trade, built storage depots called Horia Salinaria, and stationed guards along the road to prevent theft. Salt became a state concern, and with it came the first hints of bureaucracy, regulation, and taxation. Thus, the road of salt became the road of power. And yet, as centuries passed, the same dust that coated the sandals of traders coated those of emperors. The same salt that preserved soldiers' rations flavored the bread of beggars. The Via Salaria belonged to all who walked it regardless of title. It was the empire's great equalizer, slow, enduring, indifferent. And so it continued century after century, bearing the weight of history grain by grain. If Section 1 was the world of mules and merchants, this is the world of clerks and quotas, the quiet minds that turned movement into empire. By the late Republic, the Via Salaria was no longer just a route. It was a ledger written across the land. Somewhere near the outskirts of Rome, on the Campus Martius, stood a low building with open courtyards and the faint smell of brine. Inside, clerks in plain tunics bent over wax tablets, scratching with styluses as carts rolled in from the east. The sacks were weighed, tallied, taxed, and sealed with small clay tags marked with the letters SPQR. Each shipment had a destination: a barracks on the Rhine, a granary in Hispania, a coastal fortress in Sicily. The salt itself did not speak, but the numbers it generated were the language of empire. Rome's administrators understood that supply was control. The Cura Annani, the office that managed food for the city, counted every bushel of grain, every amphora of oil, every pound of salt. The empire's strength was not in its armies, but in its ability to feed them. The bureaucratic mind, the typical Roman clerk, was not a hero, not a soldier, not even a free citizen at first. Many were slaves or freedmen, trained to calculate and copy. Their days passed in the same rhythm: sunrise, record keeping, midday rest, afternoon auditing, and evening tidying of tablets. Their handwriting was small and neat. Their fingers were always dusty from the soft wax. They lived among records, the heartbeat of bureaucracy. And yet, through their diligence, the empire endured. They developed complex tables to track the movement of salt: how many modi a Roman measure left the Adriatic, how many arrived at Ostia, how many spoiled in transit, how many were lost to theft. The slightest discrepancy might provoke investigation by the quaestors, young magistrates learning the machinery of power. Salt was taxed not by its taste but by its distance. The further it travelled from the coast, the higher its price became. The roads made that possible. They turned geography into revenue. Road maintenance, the hidden labour. When most people imagine Roman roads, they see perfection: smooth paving, unbroken lines, grand arches. In truth, roads decayed constantly. After heavy rains, the gravel sublayers washed away, stones cracked under iron wheels, ditches clogged with mud, bridges swayed or collapsed under floods. Every spring, the curators virum, officials of road maintenance, sent crews to inspect and repair. The work was thankless and slow. Crews of enslaved labourers and hired locals pried up broken stones, sifted new gravel, and laid surfaces under the eyes of overseers. They lived in roadside camps for months, sleeping under canvas, eating salted grain porridge, and working from sunrise until the evening bells of nearby temples. Their hands were calloused white from lime dust. Most would never see Rome, though they built the very veins that sustained it. The markets of salt along the Via Salaria, markets sprang up at predictable intervals, roughly a day's travel apart. These were not grand cities but clusters of stalls around a central courtyard, often beside a small shrine. The markets sold what travellers needed: grain, wine oil, rope, sandals, tools, and above all salt. Each vendor paid a small fee to the portorium, the toll collector stationed at the gate. His booth, half wood and half stone, bore an inscription that listed the standard rates. The collector himself was often a local contractor, bidding for the right to gather taxes on behalf of Rome. In the evening, after the last cart passed, he counted the day's coins into small linen bags and sealed them with wax. A mule waited nearby to carry the earnings to the next administrative centre. Few sights were less dramatic, yet each toll was a note in the great economic symphony of Rome. Salt beyond Rome by the time of Augustus. Salt from Italy was no longer enough. As the empire stretched from Britain to Egypt, each province developed its own salinae, salt works. In Spain, the mines of Cardona yielded crystalline salt from beneath the earth. In North Africa, Vast coastal flats glittered under the sun, producing mountains of white gold. In Britain, workers boiled seawater in clay pans over wood fires, leaving behind small round cakes of salt called sal virginis. Every site followed its own rhythm of production, yet all were connected by roads or sea routes that converged on Rome's warehouses. The empire's appetite was vast, hundreds of tons of salt each year distributed to garrisons, baths, bakeries, and kitchens. A single legion might consume several tons annually, not only for food but for tanning leather, cleaning wounds, and seasoning the bland rations of barley porridge. The historian Pliny the Elder wrote that, "Nothing is more useful than salt and sunshine." He was right, and Rome owned both. The monotony of administration, in the Senate, debates about salt were rare, but the ledgers told another story. Each line represented labor, distance, and time. Behind every successful campaign stood months of quiet calculation. How much salt to send north with the legions, how many wagons would survive the winter roads, how many mules were needed to replace those lost to exhaustion. To modern eyes, it seems tedious, but it was precisely that tedium that built stability. The Roman genius lay not in invention but in endurance, the ability to repeat processes across centuries without collapse. Salt, measured and rationed, symbolized that endurance. The human side among the bureaucrats, there were stories of small lives. One surviving inscription from Rete commemorates a man named Lucius Valerius Salinator, literally, the salt trader. He was not a noble but a freedman who made his fortune controlling a portion of the salt convoys between the Adriatic and Rome. His tomb, modest but carefully built, bears an image of a cart and a pair of mules. The epitaph reads, "He carried what men needed and asked for nothing more." For him, as for thousands of others, salt was livelihood, identity, and memory. His descendants would later join the city council, rising slowly through the ranks of local society. Thus, even the dull trade of salt could buy a family's future. Decline of the road. By the 3rd century CE, the Via Salaria began to show its age. Barbarian incursions in the north disrupted trade, maintenance funds dwindled as taxes were redirected to defense. Where once convoys moved daily, now weeds grew between stones. Towns shrank and some were abandoned entirely. Yet the memory of the road lingered. Even as the empire fractured, peasants still used fragments of it to carry their goods to market. The salt trade continued, diminished but unbroken. The road had become part of the landscape itself, another layer of Italy's soil. The taste of empire when you imagine Rome at its height. The baths steaming, soldiers marching, bread baking in communal ovens. Salt is always there, invisible yet essential. Every crust of bread, every cured olive, every piece of armor polished with brine water traced its lineage back to those same shining flats by the sea. Salt was not just a resource, it was a habit, a flavor that tied together the far corners of the empire. The people of Britain, Syria, Egypt, and Gaul all shared it, unknowingly participating in the same quiet ritual of preservation. That shared taste was unity, the soft, unspoken bond of empire. In the end, the bureaucrats of Rome did not build monuments for themselves. Their legacy lies in the invisible systems they created. The ledgers, the tolls, the taxes, the careful record of movement that kept millions fed. They were custodians of monotony, guardians of routine. And yet, without their diligence, even the mightiest road would crumble into dust. The empire's roads began with salt and ended with silence. But in between lay the centuries of order, the humming rhythm of carts, the scratching of styluses, the dull clink of coins in a toll box. It is easy to forget them now, but perhaps that was their purpose, to work so quietly that history could sleep on their shoulders. Still, one wonders, when the last clerk in the salt office extinguished his lamp and stepped into the night, did he know that the road he served was already fading beneath his feet? By the late 4th century CE, the Roman world had changed. The statues still stood, the baths still steamed, the senators still argued in marble halls, but the hum that once pulsed along the roads had quieted. The caravans that once carried salt to the heart of Rome now moved less frequently. Some never came at all. Where once 10 carts passed in a morning, now a single mule train stirred the dust. The salt depots, the Horia Salinaria, stood half empty, their roofs sagging, their guards gone to join some distant frontier war. And yet, even in decline, the road endured. The stones did not care for emperors. They cared only for weight, for footsteps, for the steady rhythm of movement. The world slows. Rome was no longer the single, shining center it had been. Constantinople had risen in the east, drawing away wealth and administration. The Western Empire, ruled now by emperors more symbolic than sovereign, survived through habit and inertia. Taxes still needed collecting, food still needed distributing, and somewhere, someone still needed salt. In the city itself, the salt rations, salarium, were reduced. Where soldiers once received generous measures, they now received small coins instead, or sometimes nothing at all. The Cura Annona still maintained its records, but the ledgers grew inconsistent. Pages left blank, columns unfinished. The machinery of bureaucracy had begun to falter. Yet in the countryside, life continued almost unchanged. The peasants who harvested salt from the sea still worked the same shallow pools, scraping crystals beneath the same sun. Their wooden rakes wore down, their sandals split, but the sea remained constant. To them, the empire's collapse was an abstraction. The salt still glimmered at dusk. The road still led somewhere. The forgotten caravans in this era, travelers described the Via Salaria as a strange mix of ruin and resilience. The paving stones were cracked, but usable. The bridges, patched with timber and prayer, still spanned the rivers. A few traders continued the old routes, selling salt to farmers in exchange for grain, oil, or livestock. One such trader, mentioned in a 5th century letter preserved by chance, was a man named Aurelius Felix, a merchant from Rete. He wrote to a friend in Rome, "The road is quiet now. The inns are empty and the toll houses abandoned. But the sea still sends its salt, and I still carry it. The stones remember even if men do not." It is a small, unimportant letter, one of countless fragments that survive from those fading centuries. Yet in its ordinariness, it captures what no triumphal arch could: persistence. Even as emperors fell, the work continued. Salt and faith. As Christianity spread through the empire, salt found new meanings. No longer merely a commodity, it became a symbol of purity and endurance. In the early church, new converts were sometimes given a pinch of salt as part of baptismal rituals, a gesture of preservation, of flavor in a decaying world. Priests referred to believers as the salt of the earth, echoing Christ's words in the Gospel of Matthew. Thus, salt moved from the markets to the altars, from trade to theology. In small churches built along the Via Salaria, monks and travelers prayed beside cracked milestones that once marked the distances to Rome. The road became less a path of commerce and more a pilgrimage route, a quiet connection between the living and the past. Even today, the catacombs of the Via Salaria, carved into the soft tufa rock beneath the road, preserve the resting places of early Christians. Their walls are etched with fish, doves, and anchors, and sometimes small drawings of salt jars. The road had changed purpose but not meaning. It still carried life, faith, and memory. The fall of Rome. When the Visigoths entered Rome in 410 CE under Alaric, the city's gates were breached, but the Via Salaria did not break. In fact, it was along this very road that Alaric's troops entered. The same route that once brought salt and stability now delivered ruin. For days, they poured through the old Porta Salaria, looting the city that had fed an empire. Afterward, when the invaders moved on, the road lay strewn with debris, broken carts, shattered amphorae, discarded armor. But within months, people were traveling it again. Merchants, refugees, monks, even soldiers of new masters walked the same stones. The empire had changed, but the road remained useful. If history could breathe, it would sigh along those stones. The long afterlife centuries passed. Empires rose and fell over the bones of Rome. The Ostrogoths, the Lombards, the Franks, the Papal States. Each inherited fragments of the old infrastructure, patching and reusing it as needed. The Via Salaria survived as a provincial road, still carrying salt, though now in smaller quantities and to humbler markets. The medieval travelers who passed along it no longer called it Roman. It was simply the old road, the one that had always been there. Even today, the modern highway that bears its name in Italy, Strada Statale 4 Via Salaria, follows the same route traced by oxen more than 2,000 years ago. The salt is now carried in trucks rather than baskets, but the rhythm is the same. The road endures because it was built not for glory but for necessity. The philosophy of dust. To understand Rome's endurance, one must look not at its triumphs but at its tolerances, its ability to maintain, to repair, to repeat. Every empire builds monuments, few maintain roads, yet Rome's greatness lay in its willingness to do the boring work, to count sacks, to repair paving stones, to tax the invisible. It is a lesson both humble and vast. Civilization depends less on ambition than on continuity. The men and women who harvested, measured, and moved salt did not see themselves as builders of empire. They saw themselves as doing what must be done. But it was precisely that ordinariness, the small, repeated actions, that sustained a world. The whisper of the road. If you walk along a surviving stretch of the Via Salaria today, north of Rome near Monterotondo, You can still feel the subtle curve of the ancient stones beneath your feet. They are uneven now, softened by centuries of wear. Grass grows between them. In spring, wild poppies bloom along the edges where once carts rumbled and men shouted. But when the wind passes through the valley, it carries a faint hiss, the whisper of air across stone, not unlike the sound of surf over salt flats. The sea is far away, yet its breath still lingers here, as if remembering the trade that once connected it to the heart of an empire. The last question: what remains, then, of the Via Salaria and the salt that built it? Not the empires, nor the soldiers, nor the bureaucrats. Only the road itself, a memory pressed into the earth, proof that even the dullest commerce can outlast conquest. Perhaps history, at its most enduring, is not about glory at all. Perhaps it is about roads and salt, about people who simply kept walking, carrying the same dull load century after century. And maybe that is the real secret of Rome. That civilization is nothing more than the patience to keep moving forward, even when the world grows quiet. If you were to walk into the offices of the Han Empire around the 1st century BCE, you would not have seen grandeur. No marble columns, no banners, no gold. You would have seen bamboo. Long, thin slips of bamboo, bound with silk cords, stacked in bundles taller than a man. Rows of clerks in brown robes sat at low tables, brushes poised, faces lit by oil lamps that smoked faintly in the still air. The room was filled with the soft, repetitive scratch of ink on wood, the heartbeat of an empire. This was not the sound of battle or conquest. It was the sound of record-keeping. The Han Empire ruled through paper, or rather through the precursor to it. It governed hundreds of millions of lives, from farmers on the northern plains to merchants on the Silk Road, by means of documents, forms, and reports. Every law, every tax, every census, every order began here, in the hands of scribes, the birth of the bureaucratic mind before the Han. China's great unifier, the Qin, had already established the idea that empire required order, that control meant measurement. But it was under the Han that bureaucracy became art. Each province sent reports to the central administration in Chang'an, the capital, tables of grain production, records of labor quotas, lists of criminal cases, weather reports, even inventories of oxen and carts. It was all written by hand. A clerk might spend his entire life copying the same forms, checking the same figures, sealing the same documents with red lacquer. There was no fame in this work, no reward beyond stability and a modest salary. But without these men, the empire would collapse into silence. The Chinese called them Wen men, men of writing. They were the quiet counterpart to the warriors and generals. While swords carved boundaries, brushes defined meaning. The tools of the trader Han scribe's workspace was simple. A small wooden table, an inkstone, a brush made from animal hair, and strips of bamboo or silk. The ink was made from soot and pine resin, ground slowly in water until it became thick and black. The scent of it, sharp and faintly bitter, filled the air of every office. The bamboo slips were prepared with care, cut, smoothed, dried, and polished until they gleamed pale gold under the lamplight. Each one was narrow, about the width of a modern ruler, and long enough to hold a few dozen characters. When a document was complete, the slips were bound together with cords, forming a scroll. Longer documents required hundreds of slips, heavy, awkward bundles that had to be carried in both hands. It was not an efficient system, but it was precise, deliberate, and permanent. Some of these bamboo records, buried in tombs or forgotten in desert outposts, survive to this day. The handwriting still visible, the characters still sharp after 2,000 years. Each stroke, each dot, a breath of an empire that refused to vanish. The daily routine, the life of a Han scribe, was as predictable as the sunrise. He woke before dawn, washed, dressed in coarse hemp robes, and entered the office as the courtyard roosters called. He bowed to his superior, the shangshu, the secretary, and took his assigned documents for the day. He might spend hours recording shipments of grain, updating population registers, or reviewing legal petitions. Every number had to be checked by two others, every word copied twice. Errors were not tolerated. A misplaced character could alter the meaning of a decree. A missing number could lead to shortages or unrest. Discipline was enforced with the same rigidity as in the army. Scribes who falsified records or misplaced documents could be flogged, imprisoned, or even executed. And yet, for all its severity, there was an odd kind of serenity to the work. The scribe sat in silence, each absorbed in his task, each line a meditation on order. It was the empire's quiet religion, control through consistency. The invisible power to rule such a vast territory, stretching from the deserts of Gansu to the rice fields of the south, required more than military might. It required the illusion of presence. The emperor could not be everywhere, but his words could. Every edict written in the precise, formal style of the court carried the weight of authority across thousands of miles. Caravans of messengers, horses, and carts transported these words through the empire's vast postal network, replacing the need for constant physical oversight. The bureaucrats were the emperor's voice. In some ways, they were the emperor, not in person, but in practice. They decided how the words were written, how the numbers were tallied, how the reports were phrased. They controlled not just the message, but its meaning. The Han understood this better than any dynasty before it. Whoever held the brush held the state. The paradox of power. To be a scribe was both a privilege and a prison. Most came from families who could read and write, a rare skill in ancient China. They were educated in the classics, trained to write in perfect calligraphy, and tested through endless memorization. But once they entered service, their days became narrow. The empire valued obedience over brilliance. Innovation was dangerous, mistakes unforgivable. A young scribe might dream of distinction, perhaps an appointment as magistrate, or the favor of a patron, but most never rose beyond their desks. Their legacy was not in monuments, but in margins, and yet in their monotony lay something profound. Every record they kept, every petition they copied, was a fragment of the lives of millions: farmers, widows, soldiers, tax collectors, traders. Through ink and bamboo, they preserved what the empire otherwise would have forgotten. It was through their diligence that history itself survived. As the day ended, the scribes placed their brushes in holders, sealed their documents with red wax, and bowed once more before leaving the office. The lamps dimmed, the air thick with ink and exhaustion. Outside, the streets of Chang'an glowed faintly with lantern light. The city, vast, organized, methodical, pulsed like a living organism, its veins carrying not blood, but paper. And somewhere in the quiet, a single question lingered: how much of an empire's greatness is truly written by its emperors, and how much by the unseen hands that record it? If you were to enter a Han administrative office in the year 105 CE, you might find a man standing quietly before the emperor, holding a thin white sheet that looked almost magical. His name was Kai Lun. He was not a general, nor a nobleman. He was a eunuch, one of the thousands who served within the intricate machinery of the imperial court. His invention would change the course of history, though few at the time realized it. He had created paper. From bamboo to silk to something new. Before Kai Lun's innovation, writing in the Han Empire was a laborious process. Bamboo was plentiful and durable, but heavy. A single volume of state records could fill an entire cart. Silk, though lighter, was costly and reserved for the most important documents. So bureaucrats copied, carried, and stored their empire's information on endless bundles of bamboo, stacked in great storerooms that smelled of resin and dust. But Kai Lun saw the inefficiency. He had watched clerks bend over their tables for hours, hands cramped, sweat dripping onto bamboo slips. He had seen how transport convoys struggled to move record bundles across mountain passes. What if there was a material light as silk, cheap as bark, and absorbent enough for ink to cling to? According to court records, Kai Lun experimented with old rags, tree bark, fishnets, and hemp. He boiled them, pounded them, strained them through fine sieves, and pressed them flat to dry. The result was thin, smooth and pale, soft enough to fold, yet strong enough to write upon. It was a revolution in stillness, the first bureaucracy to run on paper. Within a generation, the new material began to spread quietly across the empire. At first, it was used for imperial documents, reports to the emperor, decrees and accounts. The efficiency was remarkable. A single clerk could now carry the same amount of information that once required 2 assistants and a mule. By the middle of the 2nd century CE, regional offices began to adopt it. Census records, military rosters, and legal documents were now written on paper sheets, stitched into scrolls, and stored in archives. The Han bureaucracy grew even larger, more methodical, more self-aware. It was the beginning of what historians now call the Paper Empire, the world's first government to run on written documentation as its bloodstream. The archives of forever the Han were meticulous record keepers. They counted everything: people, animals, tools, even weather events. Every 10 years, a national census was conducted. Every 3 years, local governors submitted reports detailing crop yields and tax compliance. Each report was copied 3 times, one for the local office, one for the regional capital, and one for the central archive in Chang'an. The archives themselves were vast, nearly sacred spaces. Walls of wooden shelves held bundles of bamboo and rolls of paper, wrapped in cloth to protect them from dampness. Attendants moved silently among them, their duties clear, dust, inspect, record, preserve. The bureaucracy had created its own ecosystem, an organism of writing that consumed ink and exhaled law. The empire was, in a sense, writing itself into existence. The art of the seal, but the hand system was not only about recording, it was also about authenticating. Every official document required a seal, pressed into red cinnabar paste. A seal carried authority, it was the mark of truth. Without it, a document was worthless. Each department, each magistrate, and each scribe had one, carved in stone or cast in bronze, its face etched with the official's title in precise script. There were laws governing their use. A scribe could not seal a document without authorization. A lost seal was a serious offense, often punished by imprisonment. A forged seal was considered treason. To forge the emperor's seal was death. Even today, archaeologists uncover these seals, small, heavy objects that once embodied the weight of a civilization's trust. The Han scribes, meticulous and obedient, lived by them. The rhythm of routine. Every empire depends on rhythm, the predictable repetition of labor that keeps chaos at bay. For the Han scribes, that rhythm was measured not in battles or decrees, but in brush strokes. The day began with the sound of a brush dipped in ink. The ink, thick and dark, clung to the hair like tar. The scribe would draw each stroke deliberately, ensuring that every curve of every character adhered to the prescribed form. By mid-morning, the office filled with the faint aroma of burning oil and the rustle of paper being stacked. Supervisors walked the aisles, inspecting handwriting, cross-checking totals, murmuring corrections. Lunch was brief, usually millet gruel or a few dumplings eaten cold beside the desk. Then work resumed, and the ink continued to flow until the sun tilted west. At day's end, the clerks tied up the completed scrolls with red cord, placed them in labeled boxes, and set them upon the archive shelves. Each day produced hundreds of new records, each week thousands. The empire's bureaucracy was an ever-growing sea of words, rising slowly, drowning silence beneath layers of documentation. The hidden coast of order for all its discipline, the Han bureaucratic system had its burdens. The endless writing created an illusion of control, but not always its reality. Reports were often inflated or falsified to please superiors. Tax tallies were adjusted, grain shortages disguised, and census numbers exaggerated to show efficiency. There was even a saying among the officials of the provinces, "He who writes fastest prospers most." But efficiency became virtue, accuracy a risk. Corruption did not happen with swords or gold, but with ink. A single character changed, a single total altered, and the truth shifted quietly, unnoticed by all but the scribe who wrote it. Paper as power over time, literacy itself became a form of authority. Those who could write, a tiny fraction of the population, could shape the empire's reality. The peasant who paid his taxes might not know whether his record was truly submitted. The merchant who filed a petition might wait months for a reply that never came. The power of the written word was absolute and inaccessible to most. In this way, the scribes became gatekeepers. Their pens could make or erase, approve or delay, preserve or destroy. It was quiet power hidden behind humility and routine, but it was power all the same. The whisper of decay. By the late Han period, the bureaucracy had grown enormous. Hundreds of thousands of officials across the empire, each sending endless scrolls of paper to the capital. The archives became overloaded. Some documents were copied, others misplaced, and still others simply left to decay. The empire's strength, its ability to record everything, began to turn against it. Governors struggled to manage conflicting orders. Inspectors were buried under reports. The system had become so complex that it sometimes forgot itself. Yet the scribes continued to write. To stop writing was unthinkable. The empire's order depended upon the illusion of constant administration, of paperwork that never ceased, even as meaning slipped through the cracks. The slow collapse when rebellion began to stir in the countryside. Small, disorganized at first, it was the scribes who noticed first. They read it in the petitions, fields abandoned, taxes unpaid, banditry rising. They wrote reports, sealed them, and sent them upward. But by then, the chain of paper had grown too long. Messages took weeks to reach the capital. Orders took longer to return, and sometimes when they arrived, they contradicted the ones before them. The scribes kept writing anyway. Their brushes scratched quietly into the night, recording the decline of an empire in the same careful handwriting that had once recorded its greatness. And yet, among all the repetition and routine, one thought lingered, one the scribes themselves could never voice. When a government becomes too complex to read itself, who then is truly ruling? When the Han Empire began to fracture, it did not happen with the thunder of armies, at least not at first. It began with paperwork. Somewhere in a provincial archive, a report went unanswered. In a distant county, a governor's request for supplies was lost in transit. In the capital, a decree was copied incorrectly, its meaning shifted by a single character. And in the silence between those mistakes, an empire began to unravel. The weight of the written word, by the end of the 2nd century CE, the Han bureaucracy had grown into a labyrinth of procedure. To pass a decree required 3 signatures, 2 seals, and at least 1 copy for the archive. To amend a policy meant rewriting every regional directive that referenced it, often by hand. In one surviving administrative manual, a section outlines the proper method for recording a flood. Each affected household shall be documented on a separate slip. The number of fields lost must be verified by 2 witnesses. The scribe shall note the day, the hour, and the direction of the wind. It was precise. It was thorough. And it was exhausting. The clerks who carried out these instructions were often the same men who had spent their youth studying the classics, reciting Confucian moral codes, and learning the subtle shapes of every written character. They were proud of their learning, yet chained by it. They worked long hours under the dull yellow light of oil lamps. Their fingers stained black, their shoulders permanently stooped. The ink crept into their skin, into their breath, into their sleep. Each document was a duty, each word a ritual, and each ritual brought them closer to the quiet truth that the empire itself had become an office, endless, self-perpetuating, and slowly suffocating under its own paperwork. The flood of words in Chang'an, the imperial archives filled entire wings of the palace complex. Visitors described buildings with walls of scrolls, bundles stacked like bricks, the air heavy with the smell of ink, dust, and mouse droppings. Clerks catalogued the records with painted labels, tax rolls of the Western Province, reports on grain storage, petitions of commoners regarding drought. But the archives had outgrown comprehension. Even the emperor could no longer consult them all. When he needed information, his ministers would summon summaries, which were themselves copied from earlier summaries, each layer introducing small distortions. Over time, the empire's official record became less a mirror of reality and more a story it told itself, a bureaucracy dreaming of order while chaos crept through its foundations. The rebellions written in silence. In 184 CE, the Yellow Turban Rebellion erupted. To most peasants, it was a desperate cry against famine, disease, and tax oppression. To the scribes in the capital, it was paperwork. Each province sent reports detailing troop movements and grain shortages. Requests for reinforcement poured into the Ministry of War. Decrees were written, sealed, copied, dispatched. But the machinery of administration could not move as fast as the uprising itself. By the time an order reached a regional governor, his city might already have fallen. And still, the scribes continued to write. Even as the rebels marched under their yellow banners, claiming heaven's favor against a corrupt dynasty, the clerks in Chang'an dutifully recorded each event, each lost town, each burned granary, each vanished tax record. Their brushes documented the empire's disintegration in real time. The silence between the lines, when the rebellion was finally crushed, the Han were too exhausted to recover their old strength. In the decades that followed, the bureaucracy began to hollow out. Local officials lost faith in the central government. Some stopped sending reports altogether. The archives, once so carefully maintained, fell into neglect. Paper rotted. Bamboo split. Mold crept across forgotten scrolls. A later historian, Bangu, lamented that much has been lost to fire and damp, and more to indifference. And yet, some scribes continued their routines, copying decrees that no one read, stamping seals on orders that never reached their destinations, filing reports into shelves that no longer mattered. Perhaps it was habit, perhaps faith, perhaps the quiet comfort of order in a collapsing world. The scribes who remembered, when the empire finally fractured into the 3 kingdoms, the scribes did not vanish. Many fled to the courts of new rulers, carrying what they could: paper, brushes, a few scrolls of law. They became the backbone of every emerging regime. It was not generals or nobles who rebuilt administration after the Han. It was these same wary record keepers. They redrew tax codes, restored archives, re-established postal networks. Wherever they went, civilization followed in their wake. Slow, methodical ink-stained civilization. The habits of the Han bureaucracy outlived the dynasty itself. Even centuries later, when the Tang emperors ruled from Chang'an again, their scribes still wrote in the same careful hand, using the same format, the same red seals, the same reverence for documentation. The empire's bones had been shattered, but its nervous system, the scribal culture, endured. Paper's long shadow, Tai Lun's invention, the quiet revolution of paper, spread slowly beyond China. Through trade and conquest it reached Korea, Japan, and eventually the Islamic world, carried westward by merchants and prisoners of war. By the 8th century, paper mills in Samarkand were producing sheets for the Abbasid caliphs, who soon built their own bureaucratic empires modeled, consciously or not, after the Han. And from there, through Spain and Sicily, paper entered Europe. Every ledger, every charter, every printed book of later centuries traces its ancestry back to the quiet experiments of a eunuch in the Han court, and the endless labor of scribes who once recorded harvests and taxes under the light of smoking oil lamps. The modern state, with its forms and records and archives, is their distant descendant. We live still in the world they created, a world written into being. The unwritten ending centuries after the Han fell, scholars in later dynasties would study its bureaucratic system with both admiration and dread. They saw in it the perfection of order and its danger. They understood that the same precision that allowed the empire to function could also freeze it into paralysis. To many, the lesson of the Han scribes was clear: paperwork can preserve an empire, but it can also bury it. And so the story of the scribes ends not in destruction, but in quiet persistence. Their tools changed. Bamboo gave way to silk, silk to paper, paper to the digital hum of today. But the rhythm remains. Someone, somewhere still sits beneath dim light, filling forms, checking lines, ensuring that order exists, if only on paper. So as you imagine the sound of brushes gliding across bamboo, the faint crackle of paper, and the murmur of ink, dusted scribes in the candlelight, consider this: if history is written by the victors, who keeps it alive once the victors are gone? If you were to follow a narrow dirt road out of a 12th century French village on an early autumn morning, you would hear it before you saw it. The rhythmic groan of wood, the splash of water, the steady rumble of stone. It was the sound of the mill. The water mill stood at the edge of the village, where the stream bent and quickened. Moss-covered stones lined the banks, and wooden sluice gates controlled the flow. A great wheel turned slowly in the current, its paddles dripping and creaking. Inside, 2 massive stones, the mules, ground grain into fine, pale dust. The air was thick with the scent of flour and damp timber. The center of rural life, the mill was more than a building, it was a world. For the peasants of medieval France, grain was the core of existence. Barley, rye, and wheat were their daily sustenance, their taxes, their tithe to the church. And to make bread, the pain quotidian, the daily bread, that grain had to pass through the mill. But peasants could not grind it themselves. The law forbade it. By feudal custom, every peasant on a lord's estate was bound to use the lord's mill, and to pay for the privilege. This was called the banalité, the lord's exclusive right to operate essential infrastructure: the oven, the wine-press, and the mill. For every measure of grain, the miller took a toll. A small portion of flour, known as the moucher, it might be a 16th, a 12th, or in less generous regions, a 10th. It was the price of progress. A day at the mill, the miller rose before dawn, often to the sound of the river itself, a murmur that had become his heartbeat. He began by inspecting the sluice gates, adjusting the wooden levers that diverted water toward the wheel. Too much flow and the mechanism might burst. Too little and the stones would stop turning. Inside, he checked the stones. The upper one, called the runner, was mounted on a spindle and spun by a vertical shaft connected to the wheel outside. The lower, or bedstone, remained fixed. The gap between them had to be perfect, no thicker than a fingernail. Too wide, and the grain would remain coarse. Too narrow, and the flour would burn from friction. He tested the stones by touch, the way a musician might tune an instrument. When all was ready, he opened the hopper, a wooden funnel holding the peasant's grain, and the slow, mesmerizing grind began. Dust rose into the air, golden in the morning light. The miller's a machine for its time. The watermill was a marvel of engineering. Roman examples existed centuries earlier, but it was in medieval France that the technology became widespread. By the 11th and 12th centuries, nearly every large estate or monastery had one. The wheel's motion was converted through a series of gears and shafts, sometimes even powering multiple stones at once. Some mills added rudimentary sifting mechanisms or levers to lift sacks. In a world still ruled by muscle and animal labor, the watermill was one of the first steps toward mechanization, a hint of the industrial revolutions to come. Yet to the villagers who queued outside, it was simply life's necessity. They arrived with rough sacks tied with hemp cord, their contents measured in satyrs and boy socks. They waited their turn while the miller's apprentices shoveled grain, brushed flour, and hauled finished sacks back to the carts. The miller weighed each portion carefully, or appeared to. The suspicious profession, few trades were as vital or as mistrusted as the millers. There was a saying, whispered half jokingly across France: 3 things are never satisfied: the sea, the grave, and the miller's hand. Millers' tolls were notoriously opaque. Peasants accused them of taking more than their due, of using hollow measures, of sweeping an extra handful into their own bins. Lords turned a blind eye. After all, the mill brought them revenue. In some regions, the miller was required to swear an oath of honesty before his parish priest. In others, villagers were allowed to watch as their grain was weighed. But suspicion lingered. A dishonest miller could earn twice his fee by theft alone, a handful at a time, unseen beneath the flour dust. It was a dangerous profession to be envied in. Between the peasant and the lord, socially, the miller occupied an uncertain place. He was no serf, his skill gave him leverage. He might rent the mill from the lord, paying a fixed sum each year, or operate it as a hereditary right. This income made him wealthier than most peasants, but also isolated him from them. He dressed better, spoke differently, perhaps even owned his own house, and yet he was not a nobleman. He answered to the steward, paid dues to the manor, and relied on the goodwill of both peasant and priest. In many village records, the miller appears as both necessary and resented, the man everyone depended upon and distrusted in equal measure. The rhythm of the river. The mill's operation followed the seasons. In spring, when snowmelt swelled the rivers, the wheels turned fast and strong. Work was plentiful, and the air hummed with sound. In summer, droughts slowed the flow, and the miller's livelihood faltered. He might rise in the night to adjust the gates, coaxing every drop from the stream. In hard years, when water failed, he might even cart his stones upstream to a working site, a task that took weeks. Winter brought its own miseries. Ice clogged the channels, frost cracked wooden gears, the wheel stopped, and the village turned to hand milling with mortars, grumbling all the while about feudal rents that never paused. The miller endured it all, bound not by parchment, but by the endless patience of the river itself. The hidden life of the mill beyond its economic role, the mill was also a social hub, a place of gossip and exchange. While peasants waited for their grain, they traded news, marriages, births, local disputes. Children played by the water, farmers bartered favors. In the evenings when work was done, the miller might host travelers or neighbors. The hum of the wheel outside became background music to conversation and owl. The mill stood slightly apart from the village, neither wholly within nor without, and so it became a liminal place, a threshold between the mundane and the mysterious. Stories grew around it. Millers were rumored to have pacts with spirits of the river or with the devil himself. Some said their wheels turned on moonless nights without water. Others swore that the sound of a mill falling silent was an omen of death. And yet, for all its superstition and toil, the mill remained steady. Day after day, year after year, its stones turned. The same sound that once lulled peasants to sleep in the 12th century. The soft creak of the wheel, the sigh of falling water, still echoes faintly in the ruins that survive along French rivers today. But behind the tranquil rhythm lay a deeper tension. Who truly owned the wheel? The man who built it, or the lord who claimed its power? If the turning of the mill wheel was the heartbeat of the village, then the lord's charter was its pulse, a legal rhythm that dictated who could grind, who could bake, and who must pay. To the peasants, the mill was a tool. To the lord, it was an income, and to the church, it was a moral concern. The law of the banalité. By the 12th century, nearly every mill in rural France fell under the system of banalité. It was an old Frankish concept, the ban, the lord's right to command, the right to call men to war, to levy fines, to administer justice, and to own the means of survival. Under the banalité, peasants were required to use the lord's mill, oven, and winer press. They could not grind their own grain without permission. Even if a peasant owned a small hand mill, a quern, he was forbidden to use it. To do so was milling in secret, a punishable offense. The reasoning was both economic and symbolic. The lord represented order, and all tools of production fell under his authority. Even the flow of the river, they said, was the property of the manor. The toll of the mill payment came in several forms. In some manors, peasants brought their grain to the mill and paid a portion, 1/16, 1/12, sometimes 1/8, as the miller's toll. In others, the fee was fixed to so many deniers per sack, so many loaves per season. The miller himself was often caught in the middle. He might own his stones, but not the building. He might run the mill, but not the wheel. The water, after all, belonged to the Lord. So the miller paid rent upward, a share of his profits, or a lump sum each year, and took his portion downward from the peasants. Between the two, he tried to survive. In good years, he might prosper quietly. In bad ones, he might fall into debt, to the lord, to the blacksmith, or to the baker who needed his flour. It was a delicate economy, balanced on the slow spin of stone, the lord's engine to the feudal lord. The mill was more than a convenience. It was a symbol of control. Mills represented stability, profit, and permanence. A mill built on his land declared dominion over water, labor, and sustenance. When a new lord inherited an estate, his first act was often to inspect the mills. He checked the gears, measured the output, and reviewed the records of tolls. The documents might fill entire ledgers, lists of names, weights of grain, quantities of flour. To build a new mill required a charter of right, a written permission sealed with wax and witnessed by the manor court. To build one without approval was an act of defiance, even heresy. There were stories, whispered, half believed, of peasants caught constructing secret mills in the forest, their stones smashed by the Lord's men, their crops confiscated in punishment. The river, after all, was not just water. It was wealth in motion. The church and the mill, while the lords claimed ownership, the church claimed the soul. To the priests and abbots, the mill was a moral and spiritual symbol, an image of divine order. In sermons, they likened the grinding of grain to the grinding of sin, the transformation of wheat into bread as a metaphor for salvation. And yet the church was no less practical. Monasteries across France owned vast estates, complete with mills operated by lay brothers or hired millers. These were among the most advanced mills in Europe, some even powered by wind, their great wooden sails turning above the cloisters. Cistercian abbeys, in particular, became known for their technical innovation. Their monks experimented with multiple wheels, improved gearing, and systems that could power fulling mills for cloth as well as grain mills. The divine and the mechanical merged under the hum of prayer. The mill court disputes over milling rights were common, and they were not quiet. Records from the causes banales, the manorial courts, describe endless quarrels, peasants accused of stealing flour or diverting river water, millers accused of fraud or neglect, lords accused of demanding excessive tolls. The proceedings were slow and ritualized. Witnesses were summoned, oaths sworn on the Gospels, fines assessed in deniers or labor days. In one record from Burgundy, a peasant named Pierre was fined 2 sus for grinding by hand against the rights of the Lord. In another, a miller was ordered to rebuild his sluice gate after it diverted water from a neighboring estate. The law, like the mill, turned slowly, but it turned. The hidden profits, despite the regulations, many millers learned to work around them. Some built small, portable querns, hand-operated stones hidden in barns or under floorboards. A few brave peasants used them secretly at night, grinding enough flour to avoid the toll. Others formed quiet agreements. The miller would overlook a certain quantity of unrecorded grain in exchange for a favor: a chicken, a skin of wine, a daughter's hand in marriage. The manor's ledger might show everything in perfect order, even as half the flour in the village changed hands unseen. Lords suspected it, but could rarely prove it. And so, the tension between authority and necessity continued, a dance of theft and tolerance that lasted centuries. The river as witness every feud, every toll, every whispered bargain flowed beneath the same current. The river saw it all, the peasants trudging with sacks across the muddy path, the miller leaning from his window to judge the water's speed, the steward counting coins in the manor hall. During spring floods, mills were often destroyed, their wheels torn away, their stones buried in silt. Lords and villagers alike would stand at the banks, watching helplessly as their livelihood floated downstream. Then came the rebuilding, the measuring of beams, the resetting of stones, the recarving of sluice gates. The mill was never gone for long. Even when war swept the countryside, even when famine hollowed villages, the mill returned, because as long as people ate bread, someone had to grind the grain. The white of feudal dues by the late Middle Ages, the system of banalité had become an anchor of resentment. The tolls, once justified by the lord's maintenance of the mill, now felt arbitrary. A tax on survival. Villagers spoke bitterly of the Lord's stones that grind our bones. In some regions, reformers argued for free mills anyone could build and use, so long as they respected the river's flow. In others, small rebellions broke out, often led by guilds or traveling millwrights. And yet, the old order held firm. Paper charters, court decrees, An inherited privilege kept the mills bound to their lords, just as the rivers were bound to their courses, at least for a time. The turning of the tide by the 14th century, Europe was changing. Trade expanded, towns grew, and the money economy began to erode the rigid bonds of feudalism. Some millers, once humble tenants, began to buy their freedom, purchasing their mills outright or moving to towns where guild charters offered independence. The old tolls remained in rural districts, but the system's foundation had begun to crack. Water once owned by lords now flowed toward markets, and in that slow current of change the miller, once despised, half feared, and half dependent, found a new kind of freedom, the right to keep what his own wheel produced. But freedom, like the river, came at a cost. As lords lost control, others stepped in, merchants, townsmen, and eventually the crown itself. The question of ownership shifted, but the struggle remained. Who truly owns the labor of the wheel? The one who turns it, or the one who claims to keep it turning? When the wheel turned in the 14th century, it turned differently. The sound was the same. The groan of wood, the slap of water against the paddles, the hiss of grain between stones. But something beneath it had shifted. The feudal world, so long unmoving, had begun to stir, and in that movement the miller, who had always stood between necessity and power, began to find his voice. The hidden power of water. By the late Middle Ages, Europe's rivers were no longer just sources of grain-grinding labor. They had become engines of industry. New mills appeared along every tributary, fulling mills for cloth, sawmills for timber, forge mills for iron. The same mechanical principle, water turning a wheel, was applied to an ever-widening world of crafts, and at the center of it all remained the millwrights, those quiet engineers who built and maintained the wheels. They traveled from town to town with chisels and wooden templates, measuring currents, carving cogs, adjusting sluices. Their work was part art, part science, part mystery. In many places, they were among the few who could read drawings, crude but precise sketches of gears and axles that hinted at the coming age of invention. The world, they understood, could be shaped by force, not of arms but of water. The Millers' Rebellion, the first cracks in feudal milling rights, appeared not in open revolt, but in quiet defiance. Peasants began to build their own small mills again, often hidden deep in woods or attached to barns, makeshift devices powered by streams too minor to interest the lord's stewards. At night, these clandestine mills whispered like conspirators in the dark. In the early 15th century, officials in Normandy complained that the people grind their grain in secret places, under cover of trees, and the lord's mills fall into disuse. It was not a cry of politics, but of lost profit. Yet beneath the complaint was something older, the age-old struggle for autonomy. To grind one's own grain was to claim ownership over one's survival. It was a small act of independence, but in a world defined by hierarchy, even small acts carried quiet power. The guilds of the wheel. As towns grew, millers and millwrights began to form guilds. In Paris, the Frères Miniers, the Brotherhood of Millers, set standards for tolls, grain weights, and apprenticeships. In Rouen and Tours, similar associations appeared, their members wearing distinct badges and keeping careful records. These guilds were not revolutionary, not yet. They served the same function as others to regulate trade, protect skill, and prevent unfair competition. But they also gave the millers something new, a collective identity that was not bound to any one lord. A miller who had once served under the banalité could now work as a free craftsman, his obligations defined not by feudal command but by charter. The wheel still turned, but it turned towards something resembling freedom. The invention of the wind. While watermills dominated valleys and riverbanks, the open plains of northern France and Flanders brought a new invention to prominence: the windmill. Early windmills were crude, with wooden frames that creaked like ships in a storm. They turned slowly, their sails adjusted by hand to catch the shifting breeze. But to the people who built them, they were symbols of self-reliance. Unlike the watermill, the windmill required no lord's permission to divert a river. It stood upon open land, powered by nothing more than air. By the 13th and 14th centuries, windmills were spreading rapidly, despite legal efforts to restrict them. The banalité could not easily claim ownership of the wind. Each new tower that rose on the horizon chipped away at the idea of control, proof that nature itself could be harnessed without feudal chains. The lord's last toll yet. Even as new freedoms emerged, the old rights lingered like dust in the grain. Lords found ways to tax the air, literally. In some regions they demanded annual rents from windmill owners, claiming that the land beneath still fell under their banalité. In others, they extended their charters to all manner of grinding engines, by water or wind. But enforcement grew harder. The manorial courts, once bustling with cases of milling violations, began to fade. The stewards could no longer keep track of every new wheel, every hidden sluice. The sound of turning mills became too common to police. And so control slipped away, not through rebellion but through diffusion. The very success of the system ensured its undoing. The mill and the market. As Europe moved into the 16th century, the feudal landscape gave way to something far more complex: the market economy. Mills now served towns, not manors. They processed grain for merchants who sold bread in distant markets. Records of payment shifted from tithes and tolls to contracts and ledgers. Some millers became prosperous businessmen, owning several mills across regions. Others fell into the new forms of debt to banks, not barons. The feudal dues were gone, but dependence had merely changed form. Still, for the first time in centuries, a miller could look upon his wheel and say, with some truth, that it was his own. The dust of freedom in the countryside. The transformation was slower. Old mills remained under the shadow of castles, their tolls still exacted by local nobles well into the 18th century. But by then, resentment had ripened. Travellers recorded bitter jokes about the lord's flour that tastes of chains. Secret grinding continued, even as Enlightenment ideas of liberty and property began to circulate among commoners. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, the banality was among the first privileges to be abolished. Article 17 of the National Assembly's decree declared the exclusive rights to ovens, mills, presses, and like instruments of necessity are hereby abolished. For millers and peasants alike, it was more than a political act. It was the end of a centuries-long toll, the liberation of grain itself. The silence of the old wheels, many of the old feudal mills fell silent after that. Some were abandoned, others converted to industrial power. The rivers that had once turned stones for bread began turning machinery for iron, cloth, and paper. The humble mill, once a symbol of rural dependence, became the seed of the industrial age, and yet the echoes of its past remained. The same tensions between labor and authority, profit and necessity, survival and control, carried forward into factories, corporations, and bureaucracies. The lord's seal had vanished, but the contract remained. The toll was now paid in wages, not grain. The miller's memory today, the ruins of medieval mills still stand across France. Most covered stones beside quiet streams, the remnants of mill races filled with reeds. If you walk there, you can still hear the faint sound of water slipping past the worn stones, the rhythm of centuries of toil. And if you listen closely, you may hear something else: not rebellion, not victory, but continuity, the quiet persistence of human work. The wheel, in the end, always turns. So as you drift with the sound of that slow, turning wheel, through the centuries of tolls, dues, and whispered freedoms, you might wonder, was it the water that powered the mill, or the will of those who refused to stop turning it?